My name is Harinder Mahil. I'm a member of SANSAD. I'm a trade unionist, so it's difficult for me to sit and speak. I have to stand up. I am concerned that we are cutting short this session. So I'm going to cut out my comments and basically introduce our final speaker for this session. Our next speaker is someone who has undertaken extensive research on genocide. He's a professor of political science at University of British Columbia in Kelowna, British Columbia. He's the head of the International Relations at UBC, Irving K. Barber School of Arts and Science, and is widely published and acknowledged expert in the field of genocide. He's authored some 15 books and written numerous articles in publications related to genocide. From 2005 to 7, he was the research fellow at the Genocide Studies program at Yale University. He was senior book review editor of the Journal of Genocide Research from 2004 to 2013, and edited and studied in Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity book series for Routledge publishers. He's the author of the widely used textbook, Genocide, A Comprehensive Introduction. I understand the third edition of the book is coming in a matter of few weeks. He's also the author or editor of a dozen other books, mostly on genocides and crimes against humanity. He was selected as one of the 50 key thinkers on Holocaust and Genocide for the book of that title. He's not only a researcher, journalist, and an accomplished author, but also a world traveler. He's traveled to over 100 countries. He's an excellent photographer with a collection of 15,000 photographs from various places, such as Bosnia, Herzegovina, Cambodia, and Rwanda. He will provide us his perspective on human rights, genocide in the West. It's my honor to introduce Adam Jones.
Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Thanks, everyone, and thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to come down here and say a few words. I realize it's been a very long day, and we are behind schedule, and here I am to throw all kinds of big picture questions at you at the end of the day, so my apologies for that in advance. The title of my talk, as mentioned, is Human Rights, Genocide, and the West, and I'd like to divide my comments into three broad question areas. First of all, ask what, if anything, is distinctively Western about genocide, or to phrase that differently, are there distinctive characteristics to the genocides committed by the West? I want to look briefly necessarily at the way that Western perpetration of and complicity in genocide has been handled in my field of study, comparative genocide studies, and how that has evolved over the last several decades. And I'd like to conclude with some thoughts on this very vexed issue of intervening in genocide. What can we say in light of a critical perspective that is informed by an understanding of Western patterns and processes of genocide and continuing Western power roles in the world today. To begin then with what, if anything, is distinctively Western about genocide, or what is distinctively distinctive about Western genocides, I think we can approach that question from three angles. And the first of those is empirical. Genocide quite clearly features throughout human history and probably extends well into prehistory. That is indeed acknowledged in the preamble to the UN Genocide Convention. In my quite global investigation of this phenomenon, global historical, it is a rare part of the world and a rare people of any size that has not had a personal experience with genocide, either as victim or as perpetrator, or quite often as both, because these are very often repetitive and cyclical patterns that are influenced and triggered by previous rounds of mass violence. So I think it's important as we look at the relationship between the global North and South in this regard, to avoid adopting a romantic vision of non-Western peoples. I don't think that can really survive an encounter with the evidence in this regard. Indeed, it is the case that in some cases, non-Western genocides actually paved the way for Western expansion and atrocities, such as with the genocides inflicted by the Zulu Empire in southern Africa in the early 19th century, and the way that that paved the way for subsequent outside control of that region. But with the global division of the world among the Western imperial powers, we have certainly, beginning about 500 years ago, we've certainly witnessed an interconnected series of genocides on a previously unprecedented scale, and overwhelmingly against indigenous populations worldwide. These Western genocidal conquests were facilitated by Western technological advances, particularly in the fields of shipbuilding, navigation, and firearms, which contributed to the particular Western prominence in modern patterns of imperialism, conquest, and genocide. I believe there's also an ideological dimension to this. I'm referring here to Western ideology's emphasis on global exploitation and capital accumulation that is divorced from social needs and context. It's about more, always more. That is unusual in human history, perhaps unprecedented. And it is a mindset that has led us, indeed, to the extermination of the entire species by bringing us to the brink of the collapse of ecology and sustainability. So perhaps it will end up destroying us as well in a kind of auto-genocide or auto-omnicide, if you prefer. Maybe there is also something distinctive about the West's claims to civilizational superiority and a natural right to conquer and exploit. That is nothing new, of course, but in most eras of human history, it has been justified by recourse to divine authority. We certainly see that in the case of the West as well. In fact, I would say that the Western genocides, and including here Spain and Portugal, of course, in the West, were unusually intensively penetrated and permeated by religious ideologies. That is not unique, but it is, I think, notable. But at the same time, I think perhaps with the rise of the West, we see for the first time a secular deity being appealed to, and that is the god of utilitarianism. Imperialism, conquest, and genocide are justified by the alleged failure of indigenous populations to properly exploit the land in utilitarian terms. I think that's quite notable and unusual in the history of genocide. What's a little paradoxical here is that at the same time as these patterns were unfolding over the last half millennium, the West also gave rise to currently dominant framings of human rights and democracy. Eventually, in many respects, and we can cite slavery and women's rights here as well, Western actors increasingly encountered quandaries and criticisms that regarding their own genocidal behavior that derived from the values that were simultaneously spreading and diffusing through these populations. And it's for this reason I'm just going to write this down, that I developed in this book, which is Genocide, War Crimes in the West. I have a feeling this is probably the principal book that explains why I'm here today. I think it is still the most synoptic treatment in the genocide studies literature of the Western involvement in genocide and crimes against humanity around the world. And I developed the concept of democracy spelled in this way and defined it as, quote, the stain of hypocrisy that attaches to regimes that are avowedly democratic in character, that allow comparative freedom and immunity from naked state violence domestically, but that initiate or participate in atrocious actions beyond their borders. And I added, this contradiction between domestic and international practice is far less stark in reality, as Indigenous inhabitants and minority groups within Western states can attest. But the disparity between democratic ideals comparatively well respected at home and blatant depravity abroad clearly forms a foundation for most contemporary critiques of the West's role in atrocity. And many, indeed, of those critiques have arisen within the West, reflecting those values. The third angle on this, and I raise this just as a series of questions, is a historical one. In the sense of being alive to historical change. Has Western ideology, if we can speak in those blanket terms, has it evolved over time, particularly over the last half millennium? How have Western forms of imperialism evolved during the colonial and post-independence periods? Have Western practices and strategies of so-called humanitarian intervention changed? Are there certain cosmopolitan, pluralistic, and multicultural orientations in Western societies and ideologies that are today under threat and are succumbing to fear and xenophobia and Islamophobia and isolationism and the like? Without answering any of those questions, I do think it is important to be alive to historical change and evolution and not assume that once institutionally established, nothing can change or ever will. How has the West's role in genocide been handled in my field, comparative genocide studies? The word, as a couple of other presenters have mentioned, was invented by the Polish Jewish jurist Raphael Lemkin. He invented it in 1943, published it in 1944, and then largely as a result of his indefatigable efforts at the nascent United Nations, was able to get his concept enshrined in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 1948. Lemkin is a fascinating character. And one of the things that is going on in a big way in genocide studies right now is a so-called return to Lemkin, influenced by the fact that most of his writings were unpublished during his lifetime and have only really in the last several years begun to appear. I'm thinking of his unfinished history of genocide and also his autobiography titled Totally Unofficial. One thing that we can say about Lemkin, I think, is that he was unusually, and I'm sometimes tempted to think for his generation, uniquely sensitive to the atrocities that Western countries had inflicted around the world, particularly against indigenous peoples. One of the very first case studies of genocide of his that was ever published posthumously was of the extermination of the Tasmanian Aboriginal population in what is today Australia. He devoted considerable sections, entire sections of his history of world genocide to imperial genocides committed by the West. I don't want to oversell his sympathy here in the sense that you can also see Lemkin, for example, being very critical of attempts by African Americans to utilize his genocide framework to describe and bound their own experiences. He rejected that in large part, I think, because he was afraid, quite legitimately in that sense, that if the United States felt that it was liable to be prosecuted under the Genocide Convention, it would be reluctant to sign it. And indeed, the US did not sign the Genocide Convention until the 1980s, and that is a big part of the reason why. So he also kind of curried favor with certain anti-communist emigre forces during the 1950s. It's a mixed record, but I think it is notable that he was extremely sensitive both to the destruction of Aboriginal and Indigenous populations by Western forces and viewed that as a profound loss to human civilization, at a time really when those civilizations were being depicted as primitive and having nothing to offer to the modern world. He validated them from his perspective as part of the great tapestry of human civilization, all strands of which were necessary. So Lemkin indeed offers us something of a model, perhaps, as to how a sensitive, Western-originated observer can approach these phenomena and not be blinded to the crimes of his or her own society. I mentioned that African-American attempt to utilize Lemkin's framework, and that resulted in a very little-known initiative in 1951, subsequently published as a book, originally released as a document called We Charge Genocide, sponsored by a number of African-American, mostly legal figures, and also the actor and singer and writer Paul Robeson, you may be familiar with. 1951, the very year the Genocide Convention entered into legal force. This was, to my knowledge, the first extended attempt to utilize the ideology of genocide, the concept of genocide, in the form of a published critique. And it was the African-American early civil rights movement that adopted it to almost universal disdain. As I mentioned, Lemkin himself was very skeptical of this approach. But it is nonetheless groundbreaking and perhaps signifies that genocide and the concept is more than a cloak, or can be more than a cloak for Western imperial machinations, etc. What about the field of genocide studies as such? A couple of other people have noticed that it emerged from the field of Holocaust studies, originally through comparative work done between the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. It was initially quite Holocaust-centric, a very high proportion of Jewish and Israeli scholars who were involved in the inquiry. And then subsequently, as it expanded, you saw a wide range of, a rather narrow range of countries. The United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia are really the core of the original network of genocide scholars. And they certainly evinced a lot of blind spots. And as described in the introduction to this book, I ran into this personally as I was just beginning to get into the field in 2001 at the time of the invasion of Afghanistan, when I published on the bulletin board, the scholarly mailing list for the International Association of Genocide Scholars. I'm sorry, it wasn't for the IAGS, it was a separate mailing list. A question that, were a humanitarian catastrophe to result from the war-making of the West against Afghanistan, and were millions or hundreds of thousands to die as a result of humanitarian deprivations, could that be considered genocidal? I asked that as a question. It was not a good idea. I was denied the right to post. And as I persistently tried to post to the bulletin board, I was eventually banned from the bulletin board. Particularly in the immediate wake of September 11th, this was an extremely sensitive area to get into. And when you had an area that was so dominated by American scholars, it was particularly difficult to bring those themes together. I can at least say that that was the birth of this book, so something did come out of it that was arguably positive. I'll let you make up your minds. Now, you might think that given that genocide studies was very much Holocaust-centric, which is to say Nazi-centric to a certain extent, and the Nazis are no less Western than any other government of the time, given also that people like Hannah Arendt, outside of genocide studies formally, in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, had very explicitly drawn parallels among the Nazi imperial enterprise and previous rounds of Western genocide and colonialism. We saw very little attention to that subject in genocide studies for many years. Eventually, notably in Australia, we begin to see the birth of serious examination of Western genocide against Indigenous populations. I think in particular of the Australian scholar Tony Barta and his concept of a genocidal society, in which one is no longer talking about narrow elites at the top with, genocidal conspiracies, but a society that is so permeated structurally by genocidal assumptions and ideologies and practices that to a considerable extent every member of that society is a genocidaire. And he explored 19th century Australia particularly in that context and showed not only how widespread were the genocidal ideologies, but the fact that it then resulted in a quite decentralized form of genocide committed mostly by frontier settlers, quote unquote, as opposed to direct state agencies. North Americans, I would mention particularly the great Ward Churchill in this context, made their own contributions, and I think particularly around the important date of the quincentenary of Columbus's invasion of the Americas. 1992, the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Rigoberta Menchú. This clearly had a stimulus effect within genocide studies as well, and assisted by the work of, above all, anthropologists who have been making a really important contribution to this very interdisciplinary field of genocide studies. I think it's fair to say that Guatemala, at least in the Western Hemisphere, became the first kind of canonical case of Indigenous genocide by a Western-supported regime, and it continues to be prominent in genocide studies. I would say today that in genocide studies, the study of Indigenous genocides is arguably the single most prominent strand of scholarly inquiry in the discipline. We have recent works that I would recommend to you, such as Carol Kakel's book, The American West and the Nazi East. Probably the title alone indicates something of the perspective. Benjamin Badley from University of California, Los Angeles, has a huge new book out called An American Genocide, which is a study of the fate of Californian Indians during the 19th century, and he is indeed the leading scholar of that subject. We have a Canadian school evolving on these issues around people like Christopher Powell and Andrew Wolford at the University of Manitoba, and I would recommend Powell's book, Barbaric Civilization, another title that I think speaks for itself to some extent as a very searching exploration of Western modes of genocide against Indigenous peoples, including here in Canada. This increased attention to Indigenous genocides has had important theoretical implications. It has assisted us increasingly in understanding genocide as a process rather than simply as an event. Sometimes a process that can unfold malignantly over decades or centuries rather than over months or a few years, which is how we've attended to it previously. There is emerging attention, although still rather fragmentary, to the theme of structural violence. And I think any engagement with Western involvement in mass atrocity in this day and age must attend to structural and institutional forms of violence, perhaps above all. So Nancy Shepherd Hughes, for example, an anthropologist, has coined the phrase the genocidal continuum to talk about the way that genocidal ideologies and processes can be embedded at sub-genocidal levels in everyday life, in everyday practices of persecution and discrimination and exclusion. S.P. Ayadakumar has coined the concept of poor side. I'm not sure it's really caught on, but it's an interesting attempt again to explore the structural and processual dimensions. There's growing internationalization of this discipline. We now have important contributions, for example, by Bangladeshi and Indonesian scholars about the genocides in those countries, which I think have now established both of those cases as also canonical in our discipline. There are studies, nuanced studies of Western, especially French complicity in the Rwandan genocide, for example. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say, in concluding that section, that Genocide studies still evinces a reluctance to destabilize certain cherished assumptions and beliefs. We've gradually given up our romantic understanding of our own countries, or at least it's been wavering a bit, but we still have, I think, a rather unexamined commitment to the healing and preventative power of liberal democracy, which needs to be interrogated. There's still a narcissistic sense, I think, that if everybody could be just like us, then genocide would end, which is a little ironic when you think about it. Let me conclude with just some thoughts about the challenges of genocide intervention, which remains perhaps one of the most contentious and controversial areas of our field, and indeed of wider public debates around this theme. It's an intensely politicized terrain. I think we understand, all of us in this room, how concepts of genocide and emergency and humanitarian crisis are often open to massive manipulation, perhaps most spectacularly in recent years by the Bush administration in the case of Iraq and, to a lesser extent, Afghanistan. The terms of the discussion are also clearly still bounded by realpolitik. So certainly that's true, at least with regards to military forms of intervention, which is what perhaps our mind tends to go to when we think about intervening in genocide. No one is talking about intervening militarily in a Western country for whatever imaginable reason. No one is talking about intervening directly against a superpower like China or Russia. So realpolitik continues to constrain our thinking in that regard. And I think it's fair to say, and this gets back to perhaps the historical perspective on things, that among Western nations, indeed, today, very few people are talking about military interventions at all. In the wake of the disasters in Iraq and Libya, and the persistent shying away from the Syria crisis, I think a certain, at least temporary, new isolationism is here. And Western states are perhaps more concerned with building walls than with dispatching their legions to invade and occupy. We'll see how that plays out. If it is a trend, it's a recent one. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Or both? What do we do? And this, I think, brings us to that question. What do we do practically in a world in which power is so unevenly distributed and in which notorious perpetrators and supporters of human rights abuses and atrocities may sometimes be those, are often those, with the greatest capacity to intervene in a genocide? And without, again, resolving that question, I always find my mind turning to a particular analogy of a child drowning near the opposite bank of a river. And you are among people standing on the far bank. And on that other bank, there's only one person. And you are calling across and saying, do something, jump in. Somebody says to you, don't say that. That person's a child abuser. Okay? What do? What if the person's only going to jump in and rescue the kid in order to drag him or her out onto the riverbank and abuse that child? Very tough. Would not most of us say anyway, for God's sake, jump in and we'll figure out the rest later? Is there some motivation to do the same with regard to certain cases? And I have supported certain cases of Western intervention in genocide, or what I perceive to be incipient genocide. I'd mentioned the Kosovo case, and notably, I think, perhaps most interestingly, the East Timor case in 1999, which is maybe the most successful military-style intervention of the last several decades. It doesn't tend to be mentioned much by those on the anti-imperialist left who don't want us to countenance intervention under any circumstances or consider it nothing but a manifestation of core imperial principles. I have a critique of that particular perspective, but I think for time reasons I'm going to skip over that section. If anybody would like to follow up on it, the recent controversies on the left over military Western-led interventions I think are very interesting. There have been some useful and also disturbing contributions on that front. But I think just for time reasons, I better cut out that part of my discussion. Given the politicization and the complexity and the potential imperialization of military forms of intervention, what are the alternatives? Clearly, if one is prepared to support the concept of military or the practice of military intervention, it must be an absolute last resort. It cannot be a first resort. And a whole panoply of other preventionist and interventionist measures must be explored, preferably first, including naming and shaming, holding people's tribunals, in cases where official agents and institutions are silent for political reasons, humanitarian interventions and sanctions that can avoid, that are targeted in a way to avoid simply producing new genocides of their own, as in Iraq during the 1990s, the sanctions regime, which I do consider a case of institutional and Western genocide. Maybe also, and before I conclude with just a couple of the more familiar actors in the interventionist scenario, maybe we need to, if we're going to reconceptualize genocide as not only events but also processes, can we think about prevention in the same way? Can we think about intervention in the same way? Namely, I was struck, for example, in the previous panel by the thought that given that the process of genocides against Indigenous peoples has been ongoing for centuries and is indeed still ongoing, is it not the case that whenever we actively support Indigenous people's rights and work for them, I'm speaking, of course, from the perspective of a white North American, sovereignty, subsistence, livelihood, culture, are we not intervening in genocide? Are we not preventing, arguably, future rounds of genocide, at least potentially? I think we are. There's been very interesting research done on the psychology of those who don't perpetrate or bystand in cases of genocide, but actively rescue. They're almost always a minority. A lot of very interesting psychological work has been done on the makeup, the mental, emotional makeup of genocide rescuers. And one of the things that we see absolutely consistently in that literature is that an enormous amount of their behavior, their willingness to help, their willingness to rescue, relies on that old bugbear family values, but not the Ronald Reagan variety. What are the values in which you are raised? Are you raised in a pluralist way? Are you invited to bring home your friend of a different race or ethnicity? Or are you warned away from them? Are you terrorized with thoughts of difference? Are you trained to authoritarianism in the family setting? All of these seem to be pretty good predictors of those who will go on most enthusiastically to perpetrate, depending on their upbringing, or alternatively, if they have received educational, spiritual messages of community, of cosmopolitanism, they are much more likely in a crisis to respond in a way that is in keeping with the positive and constructive messages they've imbibed. And that means that to the extent that we are active in those institutions, be they the family or the school system, we have an enormous contribution to make. It will almost certainly be invisible in the sense that we will not be able to point to any causal connection between the messages that we impart and the atrocities that are prevented thereby. But it might be a useful way to get around some of the feelings of disempowerment that we have with regard to prevention and intervention, and also the ready recourse to simply looking around and going, okay, what international or national actor is able to do something about this? Nonetheless, there are going to be cases where that kind of long-term and strategic thinking is not sufficient. There are interesting new efforts being made to operate at a regional level. I think the United Nations has been particularly attentive here, trying to encourage regional actors who are, of course, most affected by the spillover of genocidal crises to be the ones to undertake the mediation, the peacekeeping, the peacemaking where necessary. One would not want to simply endorse regional actors as being necessarily positive-minded contributors to this. Just look at Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for example. But nonetheless, it does seem to offer some avenue of getting around the optics, at least, of imperialism when Western powers are the ones that organize these mediation processes and indeed these military interventions. Should we boost the role of the United Nations, particularly in its mediatory and rapporteur roles? There have been many proposals raised for the development of certain standing armed forces for genocide prevention, be they under the control of the European Union, the African Union, the United Nations itself, etc. Would that be a positive advance? Potentially, I think, although if successfully monitored. But I come back again to the need to reconceptualize both this phenomenon and the toolkit that we have in hand to confront it in ways that understand it both as a potentially long-term and structural process as well as a short-term event, and one that, therefore, in asking the question, what can we do to prevent and intervene, also throws the question back upon ourselves and our educational institutions and our communities. So on that note, I think I will repent. Thank you.
The one word I will say in response, extremely educational.
Well, I mean, I think we're agreeing on a lot here. I've argued that there are indeed features that could be said to be distinctive about Western genocide and in large part created by the globalized dimension and the technological advances. I guess I've limited my critique just for to be more compact about it with to the modern age, meaning basically from the invasion of the Americas onwards, which is usually where we trace the rise of globalization. The debate that you're discussing, whether there was something essentially modern and hence Western about the Holocaust references a debate over Zygmunt Bauman's book, Modernity and the Holocaust. Okay, Hilberg, I certainly provided some of the first clear mapping of the bureaucratic apparatus, for example. As that debate has unfolded, a counter-critique has evolved that points out a couple of things about the Nazi Holocaust. First of all, we tend to associate it with the technologies and institutions of the death camp and the gas chamber. Before the gas chamber and the death camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, 2 million Jews were already murdered. And they were murdered up close and personal by rifle fire, by killing squads on the Eastern Front, or they were murdered by structural privation in the ghettos. Neither of those strategies is particularly modern. Firearms have been around for a long time, mass executions have happened for a long time, and starving people to death has happened for a long time, or denying them the means of subsistence as a way of defeating them. So there were many features of the Nazi enterprise that were not actually that contemporary, and even in their technology. The ancient Greeks understood that carbon monoxide could kill you. And that was overwhelmingly the gas, not Zyklon B, that was used in the Holocaust. So there are distinctive features, but I don't think fundamentally the Holocaust as modernity thesis holds up very well, personally.
No, just one comment. First, I'm very much excited by the book. Please, can I take it or?
Sir, it is yours.
No. Please keep it. No. Keep it. No, I just want to make a comment because I think you have opened up very interesting points of reflection, a new dynamic. So my question is very simple. You use a concept of genocidal continuum. Who is that lady? Nancy something?
Nancy
Because
Hughes.
no. So what I would like to ask you is that what is behind that concept of genocide as a process?
Sorry, I'll just write it. Okay, can you be a bit more specific? What?
No, okay, I'm going to just raise my point because.
Do you want me to explore the
No.
genocidal continuum a little further?
No, as you wish. But Mike, I have just one question to you, because I really think that it's a very revealing concept, continuum, and genocide as a process. It is, I very much believe that it is a process, and that the physical action is the tip of the iceberg. But there are something deeper, which, like, you know, the earthquake, when the movement of the earth are developing, and after, you know, they. Now, my question is the following. I believe it is a continuum, and I believe it is a process. But there is a new paradigm, which is that genocide is not only the fact of physical killing or elimination, killing, as we have conceived it. And by the way, the German Holocaust started in Namibia. It is when the German literally decimated the Herero, and where the uncle or grandfather of Goering was there, really systematized the concentration camp and the camp for elimination, physical elimination in Namibia. It was in Namibia. And the second correction also, you ask yourself, you say that the German Holocaust is against the European Enlightenment. I think you said something like that. Just to confirm, it is something we have been working on. The Atlantic slavery happened during the Enlightenment, and many so-called enlightened people did endorse it, legitimize it, even in writing, like Voltaire and others. I have quotation for you. So my question is the following. I think there may be, if it is not only the physical destruction of groups, of individuals, but a process whereby whole population may be destroyed or eliminated in a slow motion process. I think we have to reflect on what I call the economic genocide. The fact that we are living in a time when the market is really as a central power. We know that we talk mostly about government. We know that they are not the principal actors now. But there are economic and financial forces which are developing practices in the neoliberal context, which are leading, literally, as you know, to mass empowerment, mass pauvreté, comme on dit en anglais, poverty, mass poverty, and mass annihilation, that all continents, all groups, all regions are touched by the, not only marginalized by the economic system, but slowly being more and more poor and physically being annihilated by no access to health, to cure, to whatever things is. So what I'm saying is that if we introduce that new concept with the idea of genocide as a process, we may be living in an era where we are entering this new dynamic of the economic and financial forces are creating a new situation where all small groups of population in different countries may be, in the long term as a process, annihilate. And I think, just in conclusion, one point is characteristic. It is that this economic, the power and the centrality of the market, the economic and the financial practices as the market, because the market is going with an intellectual framework. And that intellectual framework is now highlighted, I think, by the fact that the gross violations of human rights are being legitimized by a scholarly debate, like legitimizing torture. What I'm saying is that, in a nutshell, we are entering a period where we have a new intellectual thinking, which literally is legitimizing the dehumanization of the world we are entering by ideas, by concept. And this is going on while the market is literally unleashed, not controlled by any government. Government have no more power to do it, But the consequences are not only the destruction of the environment, which has physical consequences, some economic practices which led to what happened in Bangladesh, for example, on this, the destruction of this fabric of things, etc. What I'm saying is that, just to conclude, I'm just putting it on the table. We may be entering, and what you said triggered my reflection, in a new era of economic genocide, if we come back to the notion that genocide is a process, and a slow motion process, whereby destructions of annihilation and destruction are not a sudden activity on one act, but the result of a longer process. And we may be entering in this period. So I'm just putting it on the table and ask if you have any reflection. But I'm very much interested by what, if you can.
Thank you. Yeah. Very interesting comments, all of them. The discussion over physical killing versus non-mortal forms of genocide indeed goes back to Lemkin, and today is somewhat, or is a major theme of the so-called return to Lemkin that I mentioned, because as a couple of other presenters have pointed out, he viewed genocide as a coordinated series of actions aimed at undermining the subsistence, the health, the livelihoods, and when you read his definition, at the very end of this huge long list of genocidal strategies or genocidal targets, he says, and even the lives. Okay? So the notion of physical killing is very secondary in Lemkin's original framing. That has changed a lot by the time the Genocide Convention comes in 1948. It hasn't flipped inversely, but now you have killing members of the group as Article 2A, the first chronologically means of destroying the group. Article 2C, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group, is also very much focused on, at very least, severe physical debility, if not physical extermination and extinction, right? And Article 2B, emphasizing severe physical and mental suffering, I think is along similar lines. And then I would say that in the era of the international tribunals and the ICC, we see a further refinement still, in the sense that because genocide is so hard to prosecute, there are very selective cases taken on, and generally only those where there is a widespread and systematic pattern of mass killing evident. Okay? Now, in chapter 1 of the 3rd edition of my textbook, Forthcoming, over the course of about 4.5 pages, I unfurl 25 different definitions of genocide that scholars over the last few decades, beginning with Lemkin, have put forward. There is huge definitional debate in this field. Genocide, to use the social science term, is an essentially contested concept. And I think we'd better get used to that and not expect, beyond the very limited legal context of the Genocide Convention, I have always argued that that is actually going to be secondary to the role of genocide in our discourse. I think it is probably in the long term going to be more significant, first of all, as we could say, as an intellectual or historical heuristic, as a kind of lens on social reality and an interpretation of it, and as an activist tool. The word is maybe the most powerful word in the English language. Which is amazing when you think that it's an invented word and cobbled together from Greek and Latin roots. And that gives it an enormous power in discourse and in narratives, and that ordinary people can access. And should try to do so responsibly, in part because of the power of the word. Don't throw it around in a cavalier fashion, but the power of it is very significant. That debate will continue, and I think that we're perhaps seeing a bit of a split between scholarship being more and more interested in exploring non-physical forms of genocide or non-mortal forms of genocide, and international discourse and legal discourse is actually being more and more focused on that narrow subcategory. Keep in mind also the category of crimes against humanity, which I haven't said anything about, but which I think is a beautiful concept, powerful concept. I have written a short book called Crimes Against Humanity, A Beginner's Guide, which seeks to explore these in terms not only of criminal actions, but the social movements and responses that have opposed those actions, in the case of, for example, slavery and so on. And crimes against humanity is, unfortunately now, a little bit, you know, excluded from the dinner table of a lot of these discussions for some reason, because it doesn't resonate with us quite the way that the word genocide does. But it is not subordinate in international law. And if you can get a conviction for crimes against humanity, you are likely to put the person behind bars for about the same length of time as if you convict them for genocide. And that's one of the reasons why I think in the legal sphere we are going to see more and more movement towards crimes against humanity, which perhaps it was you that pointed out earlier on. It's also a much broader and more capacious framing to a certain extent. I want to leave that alone. Let me just say a couple of things about your final comment about market forces and so on. Absolutely. Economic genocide. I think that's very much what, I hope I've got the pronunciation right, Ayuda Kumar has explored with this concept of poor side. That article was published in the 1970s, actually, and if you just Google in a university search, index search, just Google poor side, there's not going to be that many articles using the term, and you'll get his original one. I think he's making an argument that's quite parallel to yours. I think it is absolutely necessary to, perhaps employing the concept of the genocidal continuum, to understand the way that economic processes and relationships can have genocidal outcomes, particularly in a protracted sense over time. But in terms of the historical angle on this that I posed, it does seem to me that particularly as self-defined progressives or leftists, we are to a certain extent associating the global market with Western capitalism. Okay? Which has been true for a long time. It's not unusual that we'd make that connection. What do we do in a world where the principal power pursuing a traditional Western-style imperial strategy with probably the greatest success, anyway, with the greatest and most explosive expansion, is China? All right? Well, how do we talk about things like China buying up vast tracts of arable land in Africa, with all of the implications of that for subsistence? One of the points I was going to make in the critique of some leftist thinking about genocide and genocide intervention, which I didn't really have a chance to get to in detail, but is that old adage that when you only have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, okay? And we need to look closely at our hammers and make sure that we are, to drag out the metaphor beyond bearing, choosing the right tool from our kit, you know, and that we have a conceptual toolkit which is contemporary enough in its relevance to accommodate the quite dramatic structural transformations in global market forces that we are witnessing as we move towards, I think, a substantially multipolar world, which is not by any means to say a world of equality, but a world in which a certain number of superpowers or major powers from the global south as well as the global north will be the commandeers of that particular structure. So to the extent that economic genocide needs to be prominent in our framings, I think we need to have a truly global vision of that and a historical understanding of the way it's moving.
But, you would agree that the new forces are global forces. They are no more Western.
I think they've been global forces in one way or another for 500 years, and we're seeing the latest. Thank you very much for your attention, everyone.
Thank you all very much for coming, and a very interesting presentations, very interesting discussion. I'm really amazed that Dulu Dien ended this, I think, very appropriately. He's the one who started us with this conference, and he ended it with by picking up on Adam's presentation, by opening an area of thought. And yes, indeed, we have to think about neoliberalism, market, imperialism, and what it does to humanity as such, and not just poor side, but basically what I think Adam talked about as omnicide. And that's the direction in which, indeed, we seem to be moving. But this is, of course, not the last word. There is, as I'm a devotee of Bakhtin, and I'll end with reference to him and his dictum: there is no final word. And but what there is an opening, and I think we have been opened towards thought, towards thinking. Thank you.